gospel lesson is an example of what's called a theophany. Theophany comes from Greek, and it simply means the revealing of God. This is not the only example, but it's certainly perhaps one of the most famous examples. And as I'm reading this story, I guess I find myself wondering, and maybe you do too, could you imagine what that conversation must have been like? I mean, there's Jesus. And our text tells us he's having a conversation with Moses and with Elijah. Could you imagine what they might have been talking about? Now, we're given a little glimpse of this. We're given a little glimpse, and they said they're talking about his imminent departure. They're talking about what will be fulfilled in Jerusalem. But still, just to imagine what it was like to listen to that. It's pretty clear that this is one of those events that happened so that the disciples might believe. It's an extraordinary occurrence, like so many that are recorded in the Gospels for us. And I will tell you that I personally, I'm happy to believe that. You know, I'm one of those people who are very happy to believe in miracles. I have no problem believing in the idea that Jesus was able to feed 5,000 people. I have no problem believing in the idea that Jesus would walk on water. I don't have a problem believing those things, and maybe you don't either. But part of that, I have to confess, is because I was taught to believe those things. I grew up in a home where we were simply told, well, this is the Bible, and you believe it. And then I went to a church where we were told, well, this is the Bible, and you believe it. Not believe it in my formative years really was not an option. So as I got older, it didn't occur to me, perhaps, that, well, maybe I shouldn't trust in these things. I'm also aware that we live in a world where, let's face it, there's not a high premium on trust. Everybody have their email accounts passworded? Do you share your bank PIN number with anyone? Do you leave the doors to your house unlocked? How about the keys to your car? Do you leave them in the ignition if you park on the street? Trust, it's not a big thing in our society. And I suspect that for a lot of people, to place trust in a miraculous occurrence that may or may not have happened 2,000 years ago, it's tough to get past that. You know, I know many people who wear outfits like this one, who will tell you, I just can't believe that. And all the more I know people who have cultural reasons why they can't, or they should, or they won't believe such a miraculous occurrence. So I guess in some ways today's message may be more for those individuals. And if you happen to be one of those individuals, well, you're in the right place. But even if you're not, even if you firmly believe, no, I trust this pastor, I know that this happened, well, maybe there's something in it for us. And we're going to stipulate the fact we all believe this. This sermon could go in a whole different direction. We could talk about a lot of other things. You know, I began to think about this, and maybe if we simply stipulated the fact that this truly happened, maybe we could talk about the relativistic nature of time. Right? Here's Moses and Elijah, people who supposedly, from Jesus' perspective, lived hundreds of years earlier. And he's talking to them. How is this possible? Or maybe we could have a sermon about the fact that death is simply an illusion. Maybe death is not the end. But we'll have to leave that off for a different time, because what I'd like to do today is to do something that I'm pretty well convinced that the authors of Luke had in mind. To see this event as narrative. For after all, that's what it is. It is a narrative. We're told that all Scripture is God-breathed and given for our understanding. A narrative by which we may learn something of the character of God. And if, as I'm fond of saying, we allow the narrative to lead us, we might learn something about our own character as well. There's a fascinating thing about Scripture. At least I think it's fascinating. Have you ever noticed how compact it is? Scripture is very compact. You know, if this little incident, say this incident were told by Stephen King, it would go on for pages. Or heaven help us, what if Thomas Wolfe wrote this scene? You know, you have 37 chapters on the Transfiguration. Or Dostoevsky. Or better yet, Tolstoy. We have the dream sequence within the dream sequence that Peter was thinking about as he was rubbing the sand out of his eyes. But the authors of Luke give us just a couple of paragraphs about this. And because it is so compact, I really believe that in trying to understand what perhaps this is saying to us across 2,000 years, there are no wasted words. I would submit to you that every word that's been written down has a meaning. It's there for a purpose. Now, we're not going to look at every single one, but there are a few key things that I'd like to point out, and maybe they'll help us understand. It's only up to a mountain. And Jesus takes Peter and James and John, and they go up to this mountain, and that's the first clue. That's the first clue. You see, today we have this affectation. It really is a modern, even postmodern affectation. And all you got to do is say, well, look at me and see, I'm in no condition to do this. But I hear tell that some people actually enjoy climbing mountains, what's the expression? Just because they're there. Now, if you look at me, I would have to have a pretty good reason to want to try to climb a mountain. But other folks will climb mountains just for the sheer joy of it. But in Jesus' day, for Semitic peoples in general, if there were no practical reason, no obvious and practical reason to climb a mountain, the other reason would be to get close to God. I want you to think about how often mountains are mentioned in Scripture. When Moses goes to confer with God, he does so on top of a mountain. Mountains are thought of by the Semitic peoples as the place where you go to meet God. And I don't believe that the authors of Luke were blind to this fact. So the authors of Luke have Jesus and Peter and James and John going up to a mountain to get closer to God. This is more or less backed up by the fact that when they get there, the next thing we're told they do is they begin to pray. They begin to pray. So they're up on this mountain, and we assume they're doing so to get closer to God, and that's our first clue, that's our first fact. And then the next thing that happens is that some transformation takes place. Jesus begins to change. Now the change is nothing short of startling. Did you catch the language there? His face begins to change, and his clothing becomes brighter than a flash of lightning. Have you ever seen a flash of lightning? Have you ever had lightning come down close to you? That, my friends, is an experience. Although I'm not much on climbing mountains, I was for a while into camping, and when you're young and foolish, you don't think about these things, or maybe you listen to someone else who thinks about them even less. You find yourself pitching a tent in an open field. And an open field sounds like a great place to pitch a tent until it starts to rain. But it's not the rain that's the problem. And it's not the thunder that's the problem. It's the lightning that's the problem. You know, I can make the argument that you haven't lived until you're in an open field, during an electrical storm, lying flat on the ground, because you do have the presence of mind to realize you do not want to be the tallest thing in the field. Well, lightning is bright. So, Jesus' clothing becomes brighter than lightning. And then they begin to enter. The clouds have a tendency to do things. Am I right? Clouds have a tendency to obfuscate. Especially when they're low to the ground. Ever been inside of a cloud? You probably have. If you've flown a plane, you've probably been inside of a cloud, at least for a few minutes. And if you've ever had to drive or even walk through fog, you have actually been inside of a cloud. I know I've had the occasion to drive through fog that's so dense, you really have to question your sanity if you keep driving. Really, I've been in a car when the cloud is so thick, the smartest thing to do is to simply pull over to the side of the road, assuming you can find it. So that's the cloud, and they are afraid. Perhaps they're afraid because of what they just saw happen to Jesus. There's something else that happens in there. Did you catch what else happened? I guess this is the place where I can just divert it to relativistic time or all kinds of other things, but there's Moses and Elijah. Not any two men. You know, he could have said, well, there was Jesus talking to Abel and Solomon. There was Jesus talking to Meshach and Obadiah. And we can just come up with all kinds of names, all kinds of possibilities. And he's talking to Moses and Elijah. And I think that's our second clue. Why Moses and Elijah? I'm going out on a little bit of a limb here, but I would suggest that for the Jew, Moses represented something. Moses represented the law. Moses is seen as the giver of the law. And Elijah represented something as well. Elijah was by many considered to be the mightiest of the prophets. The one who perhaps most exemplified the clear Spirit of God. So here is Jesus standing symbolically, metaphorically, between the law and the prophets. Jesus standing amidst the law and the prophets. The next thing that happens may tell us a little bit more about ourselves and about God. It's our friend Peter. It's our good buddy Peter. Maybe you know a guy like this. Maybe you are a guy like this. I don't know. Have you ever met someone who's, they're always ready. They're always ready. You suggest something, even if you're just thinking out loud. You suggest something and they're there. You know what I mean? I mean, good old Peter. He sees Jesus walking on the water. Oh, can I do that too? Before there's even an answer, he's already out. He's already out to drink. So here's Peter, kind of groggy, and he's looking around, and he sees Jesus there, and he sees Moses, and he sees Elijah. And I will confess to you, I do kind of wonder how they knew it was Moses and Elijah. They didn't have photographs. We know they didn't have graven images. But the authors of Luke tell us they knew it was Moses and Elijah, so we'll just stipulate that. Peter says, well, this particular text reads dwellings. We could translate that word potentially as tabernacles, but I kind of just like houses. I mean, as a dwelling, Peter comes up and says, oh my gosh, it is good to be here, Lord. It is just good. Look at this, it's great. I mean, Jesus, you're glowing. Jesus, you never looked so good, man. And there's Moses next to you, he's kind of glowing too. And then that must be Elijah, and he's glowing too. And you're all glowing. And you know what? We'll just stay here. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to build you guys 3 houses. And we'll just live here. Thoughts of their friends left at the bottom of the mountain are forgotten. Thoughts of any purpose are forgotten, and this is what humanity tends to do, or at least it's one of the things humanity tends to do when it encounters divinity. It tries to own it. It tries to tame it. It tries to box it in. It tries to control it. That's right about when the next actor comes on the stage. When the clouds come and obfuscate everything. In the midst of the obfuscation is the voice of God through the cloud, through the confusion. The voice of God is heard. And the voice of God says, "This is my beloved Son. Listen to him." Now when the clouds clear, where's Moses? He's gone. When the clouds clear, where is Elijah? He's gone as well. Only Jesus is standing there. The law, the prophets, obfuscation, human desire to hold on to divinity, to box it in, to control it, all gone. Only Jesus is standing there. My guess is that probably means something to you. But if I'm really addressing this to folks who don't believe anything, or can't believe this particular story, then maybe we need to go a little further. Because I don't think the narrative is meant to end here. Because the next detail that the authors of Luke give us is that they come down from the mountain. And that's why I believe the stories are connected, because there are so many places where a story is simply a vignette. It ends and we don't know exactly how they got to the next place. But in this particular story, Luke tells us that they came down the mountain. They came down the mountain, and as they're coming down the mountain, there's a crowd. He comes to Jesus and says, "You need to help my son. You need to help my son. He is possessed. He has this translation reads spirit, but maybe demon is more accurate. He has a demon. And it causes him to convulse. And it is destroying him." And Jesus' reaction gives us some clue to the nature of the one who is God's Son, and some clue to humanity. Jesus' immediate reaction is somewhere between anguish and anger. Jesus says in reaction to this father's desperate plea, "Perverse, sinful generation. What have you wrought? Why is one more child suffering? What kind of world have you turned this place into that the innocent suffer?" We are told that Christ is the visible image of the invisible God. I believe that when God looks at our world, God is anguished. God is heartbroken. God looks at the nations. God looks at the inhabitants of the nations, and in anguish says, "What kind of world have you people made this into? What have you done with my creation?" And you argue over it. Who's right? The left. The right. The 1%. The 99%. You argue among yourselves while children die. And in the midst of the anguish, in the midst of the anger, Jesus heals the child. back, restores him to his Father. I believe this narrative exists 2,000 years later to teach us about the nature of God, but also to teach us about what we are to become. Looking to the law. Looking to the law, thou shalt not, is simply not the answer. On the other hand, believing that you can somehow divine the true will of God, believing that somehow God will give you a word of prophecy and you will have all the answers, is also not the answer. How many have tried? How many have tried and led us into disaster? The names are written in bold print in the history books. The answer. Can you look at this world? Can you look at the world in which we live? Can you feel the anger for injustice? Can you feel the anguish over the perversity? And still bring healing.